We have indeed come a long way. We have reached the last part of In Memoriam A.H.H. I find myself experiencing a sense of elation and also a sense of regret. Elation at having covered this monumental work of Victorian literature, this comprehensively representative masterpiece of Victorian poetry. Regret at the realization that the extremely enjoyable experience of reading this masterpiece, this monumental work, is coming to an end. Canto 121 is a beautiful piece in which the poet works out a sustained contrast between night and day, and finally effects a spectacular merger of the two seemingly polar opposites. The rise of Hesper, the evening star, signals the end of the day and the beginning of the night. Hesper or Hesperus, the evening star, rises, signifying that the night is about to come. The poet says that there is a total withdrawal from activity. The boat is drawn upon the shore. Birds, bees, human beings, the entire world prepare for rest, for sleep. At the same time, the rising of the morning star, Phosphor is the morning star, signifies the beginning of the day. Life comes to a standstill at night, but with daybreak, the whole world bursts into activity. The fishermen take their boats to the stream. The villagers become busy with their work. The morning star follows the evening star. The day follows the night. It has to be remembered that the two names, Hesper and Phosphor, the two names, morning star and evening star, are applied to the planet Venus according to its position in relation to the sun. That is the beauty of it. The rising of the evening star heralds the end of the day and the beginning of the night. The rising of the morning star signifies the end of the night and the beginning of the day. There cannot be a greater contrast between day and night. But the fact is that Hesper and Phosphor, evening star and morning star, are one and the same. Take a look at the first line of the last stanza of this canto. Sweet Hesper Phosphor, double name for what is one. Sweet Hesper Phosphor, double name for what is one. The poet's point is that the poet's present happiness follows his past grief, and the sources of both is the same. Both the poet's present joy and his earlier sorrow had the same source, his love. The past sorrow and his present mood of optimism are two different aspects of the same thing, of his soul. The soul is one, but its phases are different. As we read the last part of the work, I feel like exclaiming how the times have changed. In the early cantos or in Memoriam A.H.H, it appeared that the poet would lose his sense of balance, sense of mental balance. The poet would lose his sanity as a result of his piercing sorrow. But now the poet has succeeded in overcoming his sorrow and reaching a state of equanimity, even a state of bliss. The poet says that Hallam was by his side when he, the poet, rebelled against the tyranny of his grief. The poet was unable to conquer the fear of death, to realize that the soul is immortal. But Hallam was by his side. It was Hallam who taught all this to the poet, who made the poet aware of the mystery of life and death, who helped the poet to conquer his fear of death, who facilitated the poet to realize the immortality of the soul. The poet says that it is impossible for him to feel once again the piercing grief, the biting sorrow that he once felt. The poet's strong imagination moves in a sphere of the stars. The poet's strong imagination moves in a sphere of stars, and he seeks a divine law. If Hallam's spirit was by the side of the poet when he rebelled against the tyranny of his sorrow, let the spirit of Hallam be by his side now when he triumphs over that tyranny. The poet seeks inspiration from Hallam, from the spirit of Hallam, and attempts to quicken and strengthen his life. The poet wants to be again like an inconsiderate boy. He wants to slip the thoughts of life and death. He wants to slip the thoughts of life and death and give full rein to his speculative imagination. The poet feels that he is in the presence of a higher spirit, of a better frame of mind, and that he will be guided by that spirit, that frame of mind, That Hallam spirit would inspire him to be more lively, would inspire him to see nature in a more glorious avatar. Let us take a look at the last line of the canto. And every thought breaks out a rose. And every thought breaks out a rose. With the help of Hallam, with the inspiration of Hallam, with the guidance of Hallam, the poet hopefully should be able to generate a rose out of every thought. The last stanza of this canto can be interpreted as an allusion to poetic creativity. In real life, Tennyson was obsessed with his career as a poet, with his achievement as a poet, with his work as a poet. All was grist to his mill, and this includes the death of Hallam. He was always in search of opportunities to inspire him to write better and even better poetry. In this canto, rather frankly, but also rather indirectly, the poet seems to say that his experience of the death of Hallam will ultimately turn out to be for the best, will ultimately turn out to shape Tennyson as a better poet, will ultimately turn out to be an inspiration, an eternal inspiration to Tennyson the poet, will ultimately turn out to help Tennyson break out a rose out of every thought. Break out a rose from every thought, and every thought breaks out a rose. The fact is that this canto closely reflects the reality of the poetic career of Tennyson. This is precisely what happened in the life of Tennyson as a poet. The death of Hallam was a thunderbolt. The death of Hallam shocked the poet, shattered the poet, drove the poet to the verge of insanity. But it also ultimately acted as an inspiration to the poet to write better poetry. Also ultimately acted as an opportunity for the poet to create In Memoriam A.H.H. Also ultimately became became the most important reason behind the spectacular success of Tennyson as a poet. Canto 123 is an interesting canto where we find an amalgam of Victorian science and Victorian spirituality, and perhaps also Victorian theology. Early in the canto, the poet makes his point that nothing in nature is permanent. The poet refers to geological changes. For example, what had once been the center of the sea, what had once been the middle of the sea, is now a busy street. There where the long street roars hath been the stillness of the central sea. What had once been the middle of the sea is now a roaring street. We think that the hills are solid, but the poet points out that the hills are shadows, and they flow from form to form, and nothing stands. We think that hills and mountains are very solid things, but the fact is that geologists teach us that geologists teach us that even hills are constantly changing. They change their form. Nothing in nature has a fixed form. Everything in nature moves from one shape to another. Like clouds they shape and them like clouds they shape themselves and go. In the last stanza of the canto, the poet works out a contrast between all this. The changes in nature, the changes in geology, and something which is not changing. The poet alludes to the immortality of the spiritual self. The poet alludes to the immortality of the soul. The soul of the poet is immortal. It follows that the soul of Hallam is also immortal. The relationship between the two souls is also immortal. The contrast here is between the so-called solidities of nature, which are always in a state of flux, and the spiritual identities of human beings, and the spiritual relationships between human beings, which are, according to the poet, eternal. For though my lips may breathe adieu, I cannot think the thing farewell. Having asserted the immortality of the soul, the immortality of spiritual relationships, in Canto 123, Lord Tennyson, in Canto 124, or in Memoriam A.H.H, asserts his faith in God. According to the poet, God cannot be arrived at through hair-splitting theological debates. All speculations about God are in vain. God cannot be found in nature. God cannot be found in the world, in the sun, in the eagle's wing, in the insect's eye. God cannot be found in the philosophies generated by philosophers. On the other hand, it can even be said that the whole of nature is crying against the existence of God. But God does exist. Whenever the poet felt that his faith in God was faltering, a voice within him told him, assured him that God lives in the human soul. This voice shattered all logic. This voice overcame all reasoning. God is a presence to be felt, not a material entity to be analyzed, not a material entity to be scanned, not a material entity to be subjected to logical atomization. God cannot be found in childish fears and childish doubts. God exists in the inner man. God works in the spirit of man and shapes human destiny. What we find in this canto is a dynamic effort to voice the mainstream Christian thinking on the subject matter of God. The mainstream Christian thinking on the subject matter of God as expressed in Victorian England. One can also find a subtle attempt to valorize that thinking, a subtle attempt to work out a contrast between that thinking and the thoughts on the subject matter of God held by other religions, other peoples, and to demonstrate the falsity of those beliefs, those thoughts, the thoughts of the other religions and the other peoples, and the splendid truth, the glorious truth of the Christian beliefs, the Christian thoughts. I wonder why the poet refers to the sun, refers to the world, refers to the sun, refers to the eagle's wing, refers to the insect's eye. Is it true that there is more in it than meets the eye? Because according to certain Hindu philosophies, Advaita Vedanta for example, Advaita Vedanta for example, the world is a manifestation of the divine. The universe itself came out of Prajapati, came out of God, and is in a way part of God, and is a manifestation of God. And there is the divine spark in every human being, not merely in every human being, in every creature, in everything, animate and inanimate. Is Tennyson very subtly attacking this perspective of certain important schools of Hindu thought, certain mainstream schools of Hindu philosophy? The sun. You must remember that the creedal prayer of the Brahmin, the Gayatri Mantra, is addressed to the sun, Surya Gayatri. The most important prayer of the Brahmin is the Gayatri Mantra, which is addressed to the sun. The eagle is the vehicle of Vishnu. The eagle is looked upon as a divine bird by the Hindus, especially by the Vaishnavas. Is Tennyson trying to attack in an indirect manner the philosophical beliefs of mainstream Hinduism? If found him not in world or sun, or eagle's wing, or insect's eye. Now the question arises, why insect's eye? There is some association between the world and Hinduism, between the world and Hinduism, between the sun and Hinduism, between the eagle and Hinduism. But why insect's eye? Probably the poet wants to mock the pantheistic tendencies of Hindu philosophy. The insect is the lowliest of creatures. By placing the insect there, by positioning the insect there, he demonstrates that there is not much of a difference between the world, the sun, and the eagle on the one hand, and the insect on the other. If you can worship the sun, if you can worship the eagle, you can very well worship the insect. So, this could be a deliberate but subtle attempt to mock the pantheistic tendencies of mainstream Hinduism. we don't have much time at our disposal. I would very much like to carry out a line by line analysis, a word by word atomization of this work of In Memoriam A.H.H. But this is not the only work that we have to do. And so, sadly, regretfully, we have not done that so far, and we shall not be doing that in future. The idea is to give students who are preparing for their PG examinations, for NET, for various selection examinations, for the civil service examination, an overall picture, an overview of the work to equip the students to face the examination with confidence. For that, an excessively detailed line by line, word by word analysis and evaluation is not necessary. After reading the entire work, we shall briefly discuss the important topics related to In Memoriam A.H.H. that could appear in your question paper in one form or the other. In Canto 125 of In Memoriam A.H.H., the poet admits that his work has more than its share of contradictions. This is only natural. The poet holds his friend Hallam responsible for everything in his work, including the contradictions. When the poet sang some bitter notes, it was because of the poet's grief for the death of his friend Hallam. Even at those points, hope was alive in the poet. This was because the poet's love for his friend, and because this love inspired in him that hope. In fact, this relationship inspired in the poet hope, fear, contradictions. I think we can say that this relationship inspired the poet to write In Memoriam A.H.H. and everything in it. The sorrow, the joy, the hope, the despair, the contradictions. If the poet sang a sorrowful song, it was because of his grief at the passing of Hallam. If the poet sang a sweet song, it was because the poet had been inspired by Hallam's spirit and loving memory. In the last stanza, the poet expresses his desire for his relationship with Hallam to be with him, not just in this life, but also after this life, to be with him even after his death, when he sails to the mysterious world after death, where he can be reunited with his friend. In Canto 126, the poet declares, love is and was my Lord and King. The central force of the poet's life was love. The poet always found comfort in love, in the presence of love. The poet repeats that love was, love is, his king, his lord. Love has always protected the poet and watched over him and, and brought peace to his soul. Love guards him even in his sleep. Love is like a security guard, a sentinel who moves from place to place at night, at the dead of night, and cries out to the world that all is well. It is love that has protected the poet, and it is love that will always protect the poet. That is the hope of the poet. Love is like a security guard who, on his rounds, cries out to the world that all is well. The reference here is to the system, the custom of night watchmen on their rounds, on their beats, shouting in order to register their presence, in order to assure those who are being guarded by them that all is well. The metaphor of the night watchman in this canto demands some critical attention. It is a very concrete metaphor because love is something abstract, and that abstract thing, love, is presented as a night watchman, something extremely concrete. It is a very human metaphor because love, the abstract emotion of love, is presented as a human being who looks after, who gives security to people. It's a very appropriate metaphor because that is what love ultimately does. Love looks after, love cares for, love gives security, love provides protection. Finally, it is a very homely metaphor. Who would have thought that the lowly night watchman could become an appropriate metaphor for love, which is and was the poet's Lord and King. And you must remember that the fundamental message of Jesus Christ is the message of love. So I think we can say that it is also a Christian metaphor. The Christian God is a loving God, especially the God of the New Testament. I'm not very sure about the God of the Old Testament. God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son to the world in order to save it. So it is a very powerful, very original metaphor which displays the touch, the master touch of the great poet that is Lord Tennyson. In Canto 127, or in Memoriam A.H.H. The poet says that all is well with his world. But the fact that all is well with his world does not mean everything in this world is static. Far from it. This world experiences revolutions, socio-political and economic convulsions. But the poet seems to believe that ultimately every change is for the best. Ultimately, all is well, all will be well with this world. The canto alludes to revolutions, especially the French Revolution of 1789. It alludes to the folly, the fury, the bloodshed, the piling of dead bodies. That was part of every revolution. That was part of the French Revolution in particular. According to the poet, revolutions are unacceptable to kings and beggars, but ill for him that wears a crown, and him the lazar in his rags. Revolutions are particularly unbearable for kings and beggars. This is because kings and beggars suffer the most during a revolution. The king loses his crown and sometimes his head as well. The beggar experiences absolute hunger. The canto admits that violence is an integral part of revolution. Bloodshed is very much part of revolution. If there is revolution, there is violence, there is bloodshed. Hallam is now far from this world. He watches everything that happens in this world from that distance, from afar. While thou, dear spirit, happy star, overlookest the tumult from afar. He looks at the world, all the changes in the world, all the convulsions in the world, all the revolutions in the world, all the violence in the world, all the bloodshed in the world. From afar, like a star looking on this earth. And he smiles, knowing that all is well. The poet here expresses one of his stock philosophical ideas, that ultimately everything is for the best. That every change, that every revolution, and even every evolution is for the best. Hallam, having gained a wisdom that is not available to living human beings, watches the world from afar like a star and realizes and smiles, realizing that all is well. In this canto, we find a fine expression of Victorian optimism. England was becoming, or rather Britain was becoming, the factory of the world. The colonies supplied the raw materials for Britain to convert them into finished products, and also functioned as markets for absorbing those products. Thus, wealth poured into Victorian Britain. Whether it was equally distributed or not is quite another issue. But the fact is that there was an immense flow of wealth into Victorian Britain. from the various parts of the world, from the colonies spread all over the world, from the colonies that were part of the empire over which the sun never set. Naturally, the Victorians could afford to be optimistic. And it is this optimism that is powerfully reflected in this canto. The poet repeatedly says, all is well. Whatever happens, it's for the best. When there is a huge balance in your bank account, you are bound to say that all is well. And that precisely is what we find here. In Canto 128 of In Memoriam A.H.H, the poet declares that in the conflict between love and death, love is the ultimate victor. Love will prove stronger than death. This does not imply that the human race progresses in a straight line. That can never happen. Human progress is not a teleological trajectory, is not a trajectory that is an uncomplicated straight line. There can be wild times, there can be revolutions, there can be bloodshed, there can be fear, there can be the destruction of existing systems, but always the promise is the hope of a better future. Hallam's mission in this world was the welfare of humanity. His mission was to draw to sheath a useless sword. His mission was to put an end to everything that was not good for the human race, to put an end to the process of fooling the crowd with glorious lies, to put an end to sectarian controversies, to put an end to hair-splitting but meaningless debates. The poet sees these things as the worst aspects of the society of the day. And the poet believes that it was the mission of Hallam to fight against them. Hallam always stood for the welfare of the people, the welfare of the human race. He wanted arbitrary power to be restrained. He wanted students to be more inspired. And he wanted the world to become a more beautiful place, a more picturesque place. It is the duty of man to advance spiritually through all the convulsions and revolutions. This can be done only through cooperation in the pursuit of common noble ideals. These ideals will prove stronger than death. Progress is the goal to be attained. To think otherwise would be to reduce life to absurdity. Canto 129 of In Memoriam A.H.H is one of my favorite cantos. It's a rather short canto. It consists only of three stanzas. It's a perfect expression of his passionate love, the poet's passionate love for Helen. Through words which are touching, which are beautiful, which are overwhelming, the poet expresses his undying love for his dead friend. This is how the canto begins. Dear friend, far off, my lost desire, so far, so near, in woe and weal. See how beautifully the poet describes his friend who is quite far from him now and who is always present with him. The poet accepts that there is more than one aspect to everything in this world. There is a lower and a higher, a known and an unknown, a human, a divine. That's how it is. Perhaps the poet wants to make it clear that everyone, the poet himself included, everyone, Hallam himself included, is an amalgam of these contradictory elements. The poet wants to make it clear that Hallam was very human. So was the poet. And that the relationship between the poet and Hallam is a very human relationship. See what the poet says. I sometimes find it difficult to read these lines without tears trickling down my cheeks. Dear heavenly friend, that canst not die, mine, mine, forever, ever mine. See how the poet expresses his extremely possessive love for Hallam. Hallam is dead and gone. But for that precise reason, Hallam is always with the poet. And the poet believes that Hallam belongs to him. The poet admits that there is something at least slightly weird about this relationship. By addressing Hallam as strange friend, perhaps the poet himself feels that he is going a bit too far. Strange friend. There is something weird about this relationship. Hallam is dead. Hallam is no longer alive. But see this obsession with Hallam as experienced by the poet, as expressed by the poet. Strange friend, past, present, and to be. The poet sees Hallam as his eternal friend, as his immortal friend. His friend of the past, his friend of the present, and his friend of the future. Behold, I dream a dream of good and mingle all the world with thee. The poet dreams of the welfare of the world. The poet dreams of a better world. The poet dreams of good things happening to everyone in this world. And that dream mingles with Hallam. Hallam was that sort of a person who always cared for the world, who always worked for the welfare of the world, who always aimed at creating a better world. So it is only natural that when the poet dreams of a better world, the dream of that world mingles with his relationship with Hallam. In Canto 130, or in Memoriam A.H.H, the poet says that he is able to see Hallam in every aspect of nature, in the rolling air, in the flowing waters, in the rising sun, in the setting sun. What has happened to Hallam? What art thou then? What art thou then? I cannot guess. The poet is not sure what has happened to Hallam. All he knows is that he is able to see Hallam everywhere. His present love for Hallam involves and includes the love he had for Hallam before. My love is vaster passion now. The love that the poet feels for his friend is now a vaster passion. He loves the entire universe because he sees his friend in every aspect of the universe. Hallam has become mixed with God and nature. The earlier love was a particular love, was a specific love, was a focused love. The present love is more diffused, more vast. But the poet seems to love Hallam much more than he loved him in the past. I seem to love thee more and more. Hallam is not here, Hallam is far off. Hallam is in heaven. But the poet feels that Hallam is very near him. The poet is certain that he will not lose Hallam even after his death. The spirit of Hallam guides and inspires the poet and is responsible for the joy of the poet, the welfare of the poet. And the poet is certain that he shall not lose Hallam even after the poet dies. We come to the very last canto of In Memoriam A.H.H, Canto 131. We must remember that this is a work which was born out of colossal tragedy. And it is this set of circumstances that is reflected in the very last canto of the work. The poet says that to live is to suffer shock. To live is to endure. But that is not the full story. There is something in the human spirit that is capable of rising out of tragedy. The divine force in man enables him to come out of catastrophe. We cannot forget that there is a divine element in the human, that our deeds should rise out of the shocks, the tragedies, the catastrophes of existence as divine deeds, as deeds which are pure in intent. It is not enough that we suffer shock, that we enable our deeds which are pure in intent to rise out of the tragedy of life. We have to lift a voice unto him that hears, a cry above the conquered years. The solution that the poet sees is prayer. This prayer has to come from the soul of the man and rise high to the Supreme Spirit. This prayer should rise up from the depths, purify all our thoughts and actions, so that we may conquer our sorrows and become one with the highest. Flow from soul to soul, and all we flow from soul in soul. Thus, the last canto of In Memoriam A.H.H highlights the spiritual element, the divine element in the human, and proclaims the triumph of this element over the tragedies, the shocks, the catastrophes of human life. It also highlights the importance of establishing a rapport with the Supreme Spirit, the importance of man caught, entangled in the webs of tragedy, to seek divine inspiration, to seek divine guidance, to carry out actions which are pure in intent, and above all, to establish a close rapport with the Supreme. We now come to the epilogue. The epilogue celebrates the wedding of Lord Tennyson's sister. He was not yet Lord at that time. Lord Tennyson's sister, Cecily, or Cecilia, who married Edmund Law Lushington on October the 10th, 1842. Edmund Law Lushington later became Professor of Greek at Glasgow University. It is after much thought, after much deliberation, that Tennyson decided to conclude In Memoriam A.H.H with this epilogue. Tennyson himself said that his work was, I quote, a sort of divine comedy, cheerful at the close, unquote. A sort of divine comedy, cheerful at the close. We shall not be doing the epilogue, which is rather long, line by line, but we shall try to carry out an overview of the epilogue. The poet calls Edmund Law Lushington, the bridegroom, true and tried, true and tested, true and dependable, as proved by experience. The poet says that the bridegroom should not demand a marriage lay because the marriage day is music more than any song. The marriage day is so happy, so joyful that it is more musical than any song. And it is not fair on the part of Lushington to demand a marriage lay. It has to be stated that the poet repeatedly brings in Hallam, the central figure of In Memoriam A.H.H. This is because the poet wants to integrate the epilogue with the rest of the work. He does not want the epilogue to stand alone. And in order to merge the epilogue with the rest of the text, the poet repeatedly brings in Hallam and works out an interpenetration of the narrative of Hallam loving Emilia, getting engaged to Emily or Emilia, and then suddenly breathing his last, and the narrative of Cecily or Cecilia falling in love with Edmund Law Lushington, getting engaged to him and marrying him. The poet admits that he felt tremendous bliss on having come to know that Hallam loved his sister, Emily. They were to marry each other, but misfortune overtook Hallam and the marriage did not take place. 9 years passed since Hallam began to love Emily. Yet there was no change in their love. Their love was constant. The presence of Hallam at the wedding is felt by the poet, and it revives his old memories. The poet's love for his friend is the same. In fact, it is not less, but more. The poet is now a changed person. He bids farewell to the elegiac vein of poetry which he had earlier practiced. He has become aware of a new orientation. He has become aware of the need for a new orientation for his thought, for his expression. Love is more. Regret is dead. Regret is dead, but love is more. The days of regret, the days of sorrow, the days of grief are over. And now the poet is passing through the days of love. The poet has developed into something greater than before. And love has made him something greater than he was earlier. The poet suddenly asks, where is she, the bridal flower, who is going to be wedded before noon? As if in answer to the question, the bride enters. The bride enters glowing like the moon of Eden. The poet declares that the bridegroom is worthy of the bride. Lushington, Edmund Law Lushington, is worthy, full of capability, gentleness, liberal-minded, scholarly, consistent, and wearing his scholarship lightly. The poet had the opportunity to observe the development of the bride from her childhood, from the time she was a baby to the present moment. From the time he danced her on his knee, from the time he watched her on her nurse's arm to the present moment. Soon the wedding ceremony will take place. It will involve questions and answers. The reference probably here is to the questions asked by the priest, whether the girl is willing to marry the boy, whether the marriage is acceptable. After that, the bride and the bridegroom will sign their names in the register. Extremely happy hours await the wedded couple. Numerous merry faces salute them, greet them. Maidens throw flowers on their paths. The bride and the bridegroom leave the porch and go to the grave of Hallam. The grave today has a sunny appearance, has a bright appearance, probably because of the visit to the bride and the bridegroom. They stay to share the wedding breakfast, and then they sleep that night beside the sea. The poet hopes that his memory of grief shall fade away, that he will become capable of welcoming a whiter sun, brighter days. They are drinking to the health of the bride and the bridegroom, and they wish the bride and the bridegroom the store of happy days. The poet is able to identify a strange guest. The guest is Hallam spirit. Hallam spirit is present in the crowd. It is silently watching everything going on. It wishes joy to the wedded couple. The bride and the bridegroom have to go. The time comes for the party to end. The carriage with white horses is waiting for them. They rise, but linger. It is late. The guests kiss them and bid them farewell. They are gone. A shade falls on the guests. The departure of the much-loved daughter of the family causes a shade to fall on the house. There is a dance, and the poet takes part in the dance, and then he retires. Let the moon rise from beyond the valley. Let the shining moonbeam sail and pass the silent, lighted town. Let the moonbeams reach the roof, the walls of the room where the bride is staying, and those places they had gone just after the marriage. This is the wish, this is the prayer of the poet. But where they rest is the place from which you can hear the sound of the waves of the ocean. It's near the sea. The poet seems to think that his friend Hallam, the late Hallam, was a noble type, the very type towards which the human race was moving through creation, the type which the human race was trying to attain through evolution. Humanity at present is not capable of the deeper insights and more profound perspectives that were characteristic of Hallam. The human race now looks at a thing as a thing. The entire field of scientific knowledge is an open book before the human race, which attempts to control the forces of nature and possess the earth's resources. But there is the subtext that this is not the only thing that the human being should be doing. There is the ideal of Hallam, there is the model of Hallam, who is capable of looking beyond the surface of things, who was capable of more profound insights, perspectives, and knowledge. Man is no longer half akin to brute. Man is capable of thought and action, of hope and suffering. It is after facing great difficulties, after battling much through darkness, and after many deep communions with itself that the soul of the struggler has emerged with clear and steadfast belief in a God which ever lives and loves. In God who always lives and always loves. This belief, this faith was not easily attained. This faith was attained after much struggle, after much combat, after many difficulties. The poet is convinced that Hallam lives in God. It is true that he passed away prematurely. It is true that he died before his time. But that was probably because he appeared ere the time was ripe. He appeared too early. He was too divine, too spiritually evolved for the present moment. The epilogue concludes with a stanza which speaks of God, whoever lives and loves one God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves. The poet says that Hallam is no longer in this world. He is now in God. And the poet specifies that there is only one God. And there is only one law. This is a God who loves. God who lives, the living God. And God who loves. And there is only one law. And we are all waiting for that one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves. This is obviously a reference to the second coming of Christ. Thus the epilogue, as well as In Memoriam A.H.H, concludes on a very Christian note, on a note which re-establishes, reinforces faith in the Christian God and the gospel, one law, the New Testament, and in the second coming of Christ, which is prophesied in the Bible, in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Revelation.